Hello, Mage fans, and welcome to Mage the podcast where we work hard towards ascension, so you don't have to. I'm your host, Adam Simpson. I'm joined again by Terry Robinson. This is another episode of Tomes of Magic, and we are going to be discussing tonight the Mage Storytellers Companion and the Storyteller screen that was bundled with it originally back in the day. And before I roll it into tonight's episode, I would like to just open it up for maybe a few announcements or anything worth mentioning on the side. Terry, what do you got?
I am continue to truck through the attempt I am making at making an SRD, which is a system resource document, a rules reference for Mage the Ascension. It is based off of M20, and I am never not amazed by the little system gems that I have found in this process. My current favorite is the fact that a car that hits you at 0.6 miles per hour will do 1 bashing damage. You can soak it, but it still does 1 bashing damage. So this means that one of the most effective ways to take out an Archmage, unless they have stamina of at least 6, is bumper cars. And I have the systems to prove it. So that project is going along. Thank you to everyone in the Discord who has been helping me. I'm at 15,000 words, and that covers almost everything in Mage except for 2 things: magic and combat. And how much space could those 2 things take up? I mean, I have to be basically done. I am not basically done. This is vastly more complicated than I thought. And that's basically what I'm up to.
Well, that'll be great to see once it's ready, and I'm glad I don't have to do that work. But seriously, thanks for doing that, Terry.
I keep finding things where I'm like, oh, should I include this? I realized that I should probably include a very short descriptor on what each attribute and ability and background is, just as like a half sentence, as a quickie for like a storyteller to figure out what skill to use or what have you, or what trait to use. But I am not including an encyclopedic list of the archetypes to provide natures and demeanor yet. I will probably cave on that soon, but that's what I'm up to. Anything fun in your world, Adam?
Not exactly an announcement, but I keep thinking of what would be some nice books to recommend. I'm slowly, as I can, I'm working on my own software project to give a front end to the database I put together for the recommended reading from all of the editions of Mage and a few other World of Darkness books. And so I've just been dipping into that database and finding a lot of interesting things. But I wanted to also add some unofficial recommendations that in the end people will be able to turn on or turn off as they choose. And again, I'm looking for more visual inspiration for Mage fans. And one of the things I have heard from a few Mage fans that I've talked to is they have a hard time thinking of what to do in the High Umbra. It seems like in the Middle Umbra, they kind of have a sense of what's there and what they do and what themes they could, symbolically represent in meaningful ways. But when it comes to the High Umbra, it gets harder for some of the Mage fans I've talked to. So Barlow's Inferno is an art book put together by illustrator Wayne Barlow, who was more active a few years back. I guess the 80s was kind of his heyday. But he put together some really great art books, and 2 of those I wanted to mention. Barlow's Inferno was his sort of imagining what a sort of inferno or hell-like place might be. And it's interesting because it has some really impressive artwork, and each piece shows a event or significant place that he sort of half imagined might be in a hell or a hell-like sort of alternate dimension. And there's a text description at the bottom of the page talking about what is in the picture and what it might mean. And there's just some really creative images and some really creative ideas for what's in those images. He also cribs a lot of things from the Divine Comedy and Faust and some other classical references like that. But he gives it a creative twist. And so I think that is just a really neat idea for someone who wants to try and show a sort of hellscape or a perdition kind of a place in the High Umbra. Do it with less of a strict religious framework. What if you wanted to just get the feel of that, the idea of that, without trying to hit everybody with real Christian themes? And I think Barlow's Inferno would fit the bill really well. And the second book is Barlow's Guide to Extraterrestrials, which is kind of an offbeat project. He took an alien from fairly well-known science fiction novels, and he drew detailed color illustrations of them. And on every two-page spread is one alien, but he also illustrates like details of how the different joints work or how their different body parts might open or close or things like that. And it's very creative and very interesting. And I think there are a lot of iconic images in there that would work really well for a odd umbrood or odd sort of realm dweller from some high umbral sort of abstract realm. So I think those two art books, both by Wayne Barlow, could give a lot of ideas to storytellers who are just reaching for something to throw into their next high umbra session.
Nice. So what are we talking about today, Adam?
Well, the Mage Storytellers Companion is an overflow book for the revised edition core book. So anything that didn't fit in the roughly 300 pages for the core book, they dropped into the overflow. And before we talk about that, what was bundled with it in shrink wrap back in the day was the Storyteller screen. And we have talked about Storyteller screens a few times here on Mage the Podcast. First edition Storyteller screen had a really wild image that Terry and I just genuinely enjoyed discussing. Second edition, we didn't talk about it so much because the image was very low-key, not very detailed. It showed a few tarot cards and the mage purple and a few sort of sigils in the background. I really liked it. It was very evocative. I thought it was really cool. It's the Storyteller screen that I would most want to put up on the table if I was running a game in a game store. Now let's get to revised edition Storyteller screen. On the storyteller-facing side, we've got the basic tables and charts that a storyteller would need. We've got the ranged weapons, we've got the melee weapons, combat maneuvers, step by step creating a magical effect, difficulties. It's pretty solid, good stuff. As a storyteller, I would appreciate having this all available to me. What were your thoughts on the storyteller-facing side?
On the storyteller-facing side, I think the 1E one was still probably my favorite because it had the two things that I most often go, oh crap, like during a game session, and that is how much damage do weapons do and what sphere level do I need for an effect. But otherwise, it is a perfectly serviceable game screen. I'm always thrown off by like the how to do magic thing because you're like, you should really know that. And I would want a different thing. Like we don't get any information on something more useful that's constantly brought up in the books, like ether ships and balloons. So, I mean, there's really some holes there.
Now, the players-facing side of storyteller screens traditionally have been appealing artwork, which kind of gets characters into the mood for the game, but doesn't have much text to distract them. Nowadays, I think things are changing a bit, and we get more useful information on the player-facing side, which I'm actually in favor of. But for this one, we get basically an amalgamation of the Christopher Shy artwork that will be used on the different tradition book covers. And so they kind of put them all together, and so it's meant to be an example of a mage from each of the major factions of revised edition. But looking at it, I mean, it's funny for me because this Christopher Shy genuinely is a talented artist. I mean, he really is a good artist, and there's no denying that. But it just doesn't say mage to me, I guess. I mean, it's probably just my problem. But when I look at this image, honestly, the idea I get is I think of a group of employees from an office, and they all went out for lunch together downtown because in the storyteller screen, we see a lot of the big signs out in a big city, in a downtown area. Right after lunch, someone told them that, hey, the company went out of business, y'all lost your jobs. And so most of the people in this image look kind of sad. A number of them are looking down. 2 or 3 of them look like they're mad. Poor girl on the right looks like she's turned to stone. My heart really goes out to her. She took it pretty harshly. Then I'm thinking, right, mage, right, because there's a mage logo in the bottom left corner. This is mage, right? Yeah, I was kind of forgetting that.
Yeah, to me, it looks like they asked Christopher Shy to be like, do a Gap ad, but made out of mages. And it's just all white people. it's one of those things where it's like, oh, look how diverse mages. You can look sad and white regardless of your tradition. Also, I think that's the one where the Nefandus looks like they're from space. It's a striking image of a bunch of people who are all trying to remember the lyrics to a song, or who. It also looks like when you're trying to approach one of the popular kids and everyone is trying to very obviously look like they're not looking at you. Like, no, they're all not quite making eye contact. Like, is he still there? I don't want to turn my head. It's a look. And I think part of that was an artifact from some of the management changes. Like Rich Thomas talked about how when they were building video games that they wanted the RPGs to all be illustrated by a single author. That way they would have a unified look. And I look at something like that and I wonder if it was that taken too far, where it became a bit too uniform for a game about having infinite possibility and the ability to change reality.
Let's get down to the Mage Storytellers Companion, which again is the overflow book from the revised core edition. Authors are Jackie Casada, Nikki Ria, and Kevin Andrew Murphy. This, of course, came out in 2000. It clocks in at 69 pages, not counting the advertisements in the back. I always like to look at these ads. It says, hey, Hunter the Reckoning, it's out there, it's cool, you got to pick this up. And they have a very, very Buffy the Vampire Slayer looking image. I guess that was a popular show back then. And there's also a hint that Exalted is going to come out. We're not going to tell you the name of the game, but it's really cool and it's really mysterious, and you're just gonna love it. So there's the Exalted ad is there, and of course it was a really cool game. So this book has 4 chapters, and Terry, why don't you start us on a walkthrough?
Chapter 1 gives me what I always want in an RPG, and that is a slightly too detailed timeline. And this goes from the dawn of civilization to AD 1999. And the thing that I find interesting about that is they use BCE, but then they use AD. Normally it would be BCE, CE. We have gone over timeline several times before, so I'm not going to dwell on everything, but there are some new interesting things. One of the things it does is it tries to set up that early in human history, that magic, religion, and science were all kind of on equal footing in their own way, that no one had quite figured out anything, and that they all kind of coexisted, which I thought was kind of interesting. It talks about how the first scientist, in this case, which they list as Imhotep, comes around sometime between 2800 and 1100 BCE, which to me was a new mention. And another new mention occurred was between 965 and 300. Solomon the Wise, who is specifically listed as a Hermetic, or who followed Hermetic principles, was responsible for ending the 10,000 Jinn plague. And I'm like, that's something I want to hear more about. And one of the themes we get is we get more information on areas we previously haven't gotten. I would summarize this section as, hey, beepers, we just discovered Asia. And we get a lot of information about groups that were active in East Asia. We get early information on the skirmishes in the Ascension War. So normally we list the Ascension War as sometime happening at the fall of Mistridge, but this takes it back literally thousands of years earlier. And it talks about the Dragon River War, which pit the Akashics against the 5 Ghost Emperor. And I'm like, oh man, the 5 Ghost Emperor, that sounds rad. Is that a Kindred of the East thing? And I look through it, and we get one other mention in Dragons of the East, where it's like, yep, battle against the 5 Ghost Emperor. I want more information on the 5 Ghost Emperor, Adam. Why won't they give it to me? We get the first mention of the Dao Lao Laoshi, which is kind of a East Asian formalist technological pre-technocracy, which we get a bunch more information again in Dragons of the East. We find out about the Burning Tiger War, which is new to me, which involved the Wulong the Akashics and the Dao Lao Laoshi fighting with each other, and seemingly no mention of the Wu Kang. We find out that the Romans were responsible for the destruction of most of the Celtic sorcerers, and we also get a formalization of the Brotherhood of the Rule, which I thought was one of the dumb things in Syndicate, but they're like, hey, nope, it was the Collegium Principiati, because I don't know how to pronounce Latin, so I'm just going to slur it and sound like a moron. It goes on through the first millennium, and one of the things that was interesting is it suggested that the Messianic Voices, which I always knew as a Celestial Chorus group, were Hermetic. This timeline just jams a bunch of stuff in to be the Order of Hermes. And we get a walkthrough of the battles between belief systems that eventually culminates in the formal start of the Ascension War at the successful attack on Mistridge in 1210. The other things in the timeline that I thought was particularly interesting is they introduce formally the existence of House Golo in 1171, the precursors to the Sons of Ether, when they were still part of the Hermetics. We get some sub-Saharan African information for the first time in 1345 to 1350. We get the War of the Dust Witch, which sees the Ngoma and the Mud Zimbabwe form. And in 1356 to 1360, we get the Screaming Ghost Purge, which again pits the Dao Lao Laoshi the Wulong against the Akashics. It kind of advances forward, and it sets up this idea that this battle of ideas has been raging for a very long time, includes much more of the world, and to me, includes into the Mage continuity all the things we learned from what is now the reasonably up and publishing Sorcerer's Crusade line, like Tezgul the Insane and the Lithuanian demon worshippers that scour the Baltic. That's a character that plays a big role in Sorcerer's Crusade that we haven't gotten information before. We get information on the Oath of Fire, which is kind of the first pogrom, and that seems to be the big additions to me. The only other notes are that they list that in 1946, the Sons of Ether were vital in healing the rift among the traditions. And I don't know about you, but when I think about the tradition that's going to bring everyone together, it's not the Sons of Ether. Not that I have any problem with them. I love them. But it's like no one ever said to themselves, oh man, us mystical groups all disagree with each other. How can we deal that? Victorian white men with Tesla coils. And they also formally include the 1947 Roswell incident as part of Mage continuity with the alien space landing, and I really liked that. Was there anything that jumped out for you in the timeline section?
At first, it was kind of odd to me that the core book had a history chapter and the overflow book also has a history chapter. It's like, okay, that's who planned that?
History error.
But yeah, but I'm not going to complain because there's a lot of interesting things here. Well, first off, one thing I did not agree with is it mentions that the Euthanatos represent Hindu magic, and I just take issue with that. That no, there's a lot going on in Hindu magic. The Euthanatos were one part of it, but there were other parts that they really never represented. We get more non-Western mage history here, more stuff going on in Africa and in Asia and Middle East and some other places, and that's really interesting. And I like that they add some what I call shadow history. It's like mage-only history that mages talk about and sleepers have never even heard of. I really love it when mage books do that, and they gave me some of that. It's like, wow, this is fun. There's some villains here. There's some events that happened in the past, some conflicts, and it's like I can flesh those out any way I like, and I don't have to worry about sleepers stumbling into it in their own history book. So I really like that. This is the first time we hear about the Da Lo Lao Shi, the 5-element dragons, sometimes called the 5 metal dragons, and this is supposed to be an East Asian technocracy group. They're part of the technocracy, but they have kind of their own culture, their own history, and their own outlook on things. Not a lot of detail given for them, but I'm sure later books will give us more. This is the first mention in a Mage the Ascension book for the Taftâni, which we'll get more information on in this book, and also the Ngoma of Africa, which we don't get more information on. But hey, revised edition is just getting started. We'll hear plenty about that later. Pretty much wraps up chapter 1 for me.
Yeah, and the second half of that chapter 1 is just kind of the set of the world at the beginning of Revised. It talks about the neutron bomb and the orbital mirrors used to kill the Ravnos antediluvian, the spirit nuke in the underworld, which set off the Sixth Great Maelstrom. We get information about the Avatar Storm, and here the Avatar Storm is presented as being much more lethal than it was in the core book, where it said, hey, some mages that go through it suffered Gilgul from going through the Avatar Storm. Now, in the core rulebook, it's like, okay, you roll your permanent paradox plus your arete against difficulty 6, and you take that much aggravated damage. Here, it is presented as something much more potent, whether that was a temporary thing when it was just starting, but we get a bit more information on maybe why the masters went away. We get more information on how the technocracy took advantage of the lack of traditional heavy hitters to kind of make their move, and the fact that they kind of started a specific program to fracture the crafts and take those over, and that one of the key things about that was rejiggering education in areas where the crafts were dominant to try and crush them, which I thought was interesting because the move against the traditions and the crafts strike me as something that occurred very quickly. Like, if this is 1999 and the book is taking place in 2000 or something like this, that means that maybe the technocrats had like a year or a year and a half to do this program of trying to crush their enemies. But if you're rejiggering an education system, that tends to take a good bit longer than that. So I would have liked a little bit more information, but that is the rest of the information that we get in Chapter 1. We get a little bit of storyteller advice. Hey, do you want to set a game while this is happening? Do you want to set it after? Here are some adventure hooks. Chapter 2 is a walkthrough of the states of the disparates. We don't really get any new groups here except for the Taftâni, but we get a update as to what is happening with everyone. And when I think of groups in Mage the Ascension and book reviews, I think Adam Simpson. Adam, do you want to walk us through what the state of the crafts are?
We start off with a section called Gone But Not Forgotten, and this is basically the disparate groups that aren't around anymore, either because they just couldn't keep it together, or most of them have rolled into traditions, which we discussed in our last episode talking about the revised core book. First off, we get the Bata, which are the disparate group of the Caribbean islands. And here we get a basic introduction to like who they are and what they're about, because we really got very, very little in the core book. And so for people who just have Mage Revised and they've not been reading earlier books, it's nice to learn more about these groups. We have an episode on the Book of Crafts, which gives more information for each of the disparate groups than this book does. And so, for Mage fans who have knowledge of second edition, there's basically covering a lot of the same ground here. The Bata have joined Dream Speakers, and some have filtered into the Verbena. And next up, we have the Children of Knowledge, the last true alchemists, and they have, for the most part, joined the Order of Hermes. And so we get some basic information on them. The Hemka Sobek was a disparate group that did not join any of the traditions. And for those who read the Book of Crafts and heard us discuss it earlier, there's reasons for that. They were a group that really had a harder time playing well with others. And what we get in this book is the basic information of what they were like before they disappeared. Because now, in Revised Edition, the Hemka Sobek are gone. And all of the awakened members of that group have disappeared. There is evidence to suggest that they might have been murdered or even eaten by demons or something much like them. And as you'll recall, they served a vast sort of umbrood crocodile god or spirit of some sort. And so the question is, did he finally get tired of his followers and just chew them up or not? It's a big mystery. The only Hemka Sobek that are left are the sort of the lay priests. These were people who had no magical ability or the equivalent of hedge wizard path magic. They're still around. They have been receiving mysterious messages telling them to abduct tourists and other people that are easy to get a hold of in Cairo, Egypt, and present them for sacrifice to the crocodile god. And so it's not clear what's going on there, but an interesting mystery to play with in your own games. Next up is the Kopa Loe of the Pacific Islands, Hawaii and other Pacific Island groups. They have mostly joined the Dream Speakers. They're not doing much on their own anymore. We get some information on the Wulong, who have mostly joined the Akashic Brotherhood. Next up, we get a section called The Few, the Proud, the Fragile, and this is information on the disparate groups that are still around. They are still disparate groups, and it explains to us that they are having a very, very hard time. They are wondering if they're going to be able to survive much longer. One thing about Chapter 2 that was, I guess, a little harder for me to understand is it mentions in a couple of places that the technocracy, now that the Avatar Storm has occurred, are very actively putting pressure on all of the disparate groups. And the pressure is so severe that the disparate groups are having to make very tough choices and might not even be around much longer. And so I was thinking, I thought that with the Avatar Storm and all the events surrounding it and the bosses and masters of the technocracy being out of communication, it sort of gave me this idea that the technocrats who are on the earth would be trying to figure things out and sort things out, and so it would be sort of a less active time for them. But if they were going to get really active and really go for something, it just seems like they'd get a lot more out of their efforts if they started snatching the nodes away from the traditions. It seems like they'd get a lot more for their effort. But according to this book, what they spent their time on was really putting a lot of pressure on the disparates and the mages of the traditions instead of their nodes. But anyways, this section, The Few, the Proud, the Fragile, gives us the Ali Batin, or Ali Batan. They are, of course, the group of mages in the Middle East that were somewhat connected to Shiite Islam. At least there were hints about that in their original write-up. And a lot of the information here is repeated for us. Now, one thing that had me scratching my head was it makes mention of the fact that the Ali Batin who are on Earth now are no longer able to get to Mount Kaf. It's something that is in their history, and they're very proud of having discovered that and being able to access that in the past, but they can't get to it now. During second edition, there were some mage books published that sort of gave the reader the impression that the Ali Batine were active on Mount Kof. So rather than seeing that as an inconsistency, it really makes sense, because in the original write-up of the Ali Batine in the first edition Mage Player's Guide, it did say that the masters keep a lot of information away from the disciples and the initiates. There's a lot of that going on. So I think it's very easy to imagine a situation where the masters of the Ali Batine knew the way to Mount Kof and were active there, but they were not sharing that information with their disciples and their initiates, who think that it's inaccessible. After that, we get to hear about the Sisters of Hippolyta, which are still around. They're still independent. There was a lot of the same information covered for this group. What I thought was interesting was there has been one change between second edition and revised for the Sisters of Hippolyta. In the past, they were very serious about being pacifists, and now they have decided that the world is a dangerous place and they're going to need to protect themselves, so they have a new role in their communities, and that is defender. And it makes it clear that the defenders do learn how to fight. They also help their community get a better understanding of how they would handle an assault from outside enemies. And also they are stockpiling weapons now, including guns. And so that can be seen as a changing for difficult times. For me, as a Mage fan, I always kind of respected the group because they held on to some values very firmly that were hard to hold on to. In the world of Mage and the world of Darkness is a very dangerous place, and to hold on to a pacifist set of beliefs is rather difficult, but they did do it. Now in Revised Edition, they are holding on to that less firmly than they did before. Next up, we get a 3-page write-up on the Taftâni, which in the Mage the Ascension line has not been mentioned before this book, and I really liked this group. I thought they were very, very interesting. Long story short, they are a group of mages in the Middle East, especially the Saudi Arabian Peninsula and near there. They've been around for a very long time. Taftâni is supposed to be an Arabic or perhaps another Middle Eastern language word for the Weavers, and so their nickname is the Weavers. And they practice an older style of magic that these days is more flashy, more vulgar, it draws down more paradox, but they hold very firmly to their traditions. They don't think that they should have to change for the modern world, and so they're having a lot of trouble because of that, but they're just such an interesting group. I would really love a chance to work them into some of my games. But to keep this moving, last up we get a description on the Templars, and at first Terry and I were talking about this because it says in the core book that the Templars joined the Celestial Chorus, and here we get a section saying, here are the disparate groups that are standing proud on their own and have not joined anyone, and we get the Templars. It's like, well, I thought they joined the Celestial Chorus, and so Terry and I were discussing it, and my own interpretation of this is that the Templars decided that the writing was on the wall, they were in a very tough situation, and so they took a number of their members and they started communication with the Celestial Chorus and said, look, we're going to send you some of our members to live with you, learn your ways, and the rest of us are going to stay where we are, and we're going to see how this goes. And so it does mention in here that the Templars who are inside the Celestial Chorus are becoming more open-minded, more liberal, you could say. They're starting to allow female members to join their ranks and learn their ways. And the Templars that are staying outside of the Celestial Chorus are still very traditional, still holding on to all of their old ways. And so I thought that was kind of interesting because I see a lot of opportunities for player characters to be those diplomats who go into the Celestial Chorus and then give reports back to the Templars outside of it and tell them what they think, and can be very pivotal figures in that disparate group. But that is the last disparate group that is mentioned in Chapter 2, and so I think that about wraps it up for me.
The thing that I thought was interesting was, one, we get a whole bunch of spicy stereotypes that I very much enjoyed. Like, my favorite shots fired was the Taftâni talking about the technocracy when they go, worse than the traditions by a matter of degree only. These soulless proponents of cold science would strip the world of everything but logic and reason. And you're like, whoo! Toasty! And you're like, and to think you have difficulty with paradox, you djinn summoning, storm riding, fireball casting, person stabber. So I generally like the Taftâni. They took them in an interesting direction for Lost Paths, which we get to read in 175 books or something like that, because Revised is huge. But the thing that was interesting to me is I think they were a little bit simplistic with where some of the groups went. Like, for instance, when I think Wu Lung, if they were to merge with the tradition, it would be the Hermetics.
Yeah, it mentioned they got along really well and thought highly of each other.
And there's a few cases like that where I think there was odd choices. Like, for instance, to me, the Children of Knowledge are not Hermetics. They're almost more cultists. Like, if you have or the group would split, where you would have the old line alchemists join the Hermetics, or maybe even the Society of Ether, and the people who believe in the alchemy of the soul, in finding a secret thing that will cause humanity to ascend, that screams cultist of ecstasy to me, especially for their advocacy of illicit substances and such in pursuing that. In terms of maintaining like ritualistic access to an area and understanding like the rights of an area, the Kopaloi are almost more verbena to me in their tending of cycles and the importance of ritual, more so than Dreamspeaker to me. And the Hemkasobek can go wherever they want because I don't want to mess with them because they will eat me. So just an idea that like one of the exercises I like doing is if we had to reshard or refactor the traditions, how would I do it? And I kind of like that mental exercise. I also like the part where they're like, the Sisters of Apolda, like, how can you teach the spheres of magic? They all flow into another. Specialty sphere, life. And it's just one of those cases where the necessities of the game kind of crash into the world presented at some points. Chapter 3 is a collections of things. It gives us updated rules and more information for spirits and bygones. And it says the basic stats that you have now for a spirit, and this is something that was inconsistent kind of across second edition, is in its spirit form, it's going to have willpower, gnosis, which covers all of its social and mental stats, and power, which is kind of going to be its gas tank. If it's materialized, it may have other stats, and we will provide those. And then it gives a list of charms and recommendations on kind of how to reskin them. Like, 2 different entities may have blast, and a fire elemental may shoot out fire, where a weather spirit may shoot out lightning. Banes will shoot out a targeted decay ray or something like that. And I thought those were pretty neat. And it gives you a really small number of entities to work with. And then we get information on bygones, which are entities that are still on this side of the gauntlet. They are not fundamentally spiritual, but they are outside the traditional classification of science so far. And the examples they give are the Greys, the Jersey Devil, the Chupacabra, the Mothman, and a few other entities, the Mokole Mbembe. And that was fine. I would have liked more, but it felt like a little bit of a cop-out when they're like, go read the Bygone Bestiary, or World of Darkness Blood-Dimmed Tides. Thanks, book. And they're very specific about every bygone you introduce should have a really good reason. And I always thought Mage never quite spelled out how bygones should be used more specifically. And I wish that had been here, but you get some information, you get some ideas. It suggests that bygones aren't just unicorns and yetis, but are also urban legends and such, which kind of fundamentally changes what a bygone can be.
The bygones didn't have stats, which irritated me because there's a number of bygones that are not reproduced in Bygone Bestiary or previous Mage books, and so it's like it wouldn't have taken up that much page count, especially in an overflow book. Just give us some stats for the bygones. It would have been appreciated. The other thing that stood out to me was reading through most of these spirits in the spirit section of Chapter 3. Honestly, I felt like I was reading a Werewolf the Apocalypse book because it just seemed to think of the spirits and like what they are and what they do and what they could mean to a game, and it really felt like a werewolf book. It's like we're talking about the Middle Umbra here and spirits of the land and spirits of like, you know, natural sorts of things. And I mean, I guess there was one or two that would be more High Umbra and more magey, but most of them were. It was like a big helping of a werewolf book for me.
Chapter 4 goes over wonders. And previously in Mage, we talked about talismans and fetishes, and that was about it. I think towards the end of second edition, we got a little bit more information about like charms, which are maybe one-time use, but this explodes that. And I appreciated that, and I thought it was really cool until I tried to remember what each one did. And the biggest criticism I have is the terms used for things tell you remarkably little about what they are. We get the introduction of artifacts and inventions, which are powered by the user, and they are normal objects with magical power. Your flying carpets, your power suits. If it has its own arete and quintessence supply, it is then a talisman or a device. It introduces charms and gadgets, which are single use or have doses to them. They may be used by the uninitiated as long as the paradigms agree, and this opens up the door for the greatest gadget ever produced in Mage, and that is in Fallen Tower, Las Vegas, with the nuclear device. And the rules here suggest that they are made in batches, which means generally you make 10 to 12 nukes at a given time, but let's not dwell on that. We get some more information on fetishes, and we get a lot of information about resonance as an idea, that over centuries, a magical device will kind of change how it works or what it does or what it looks like to reflect its user over time. Two things that kind of pop up a lot in Revised is in a world where mages are being hunted down, you need to be much more subtle in moving magic over time. So suddenly things like Grandpa's old magic photo album, or the ring I got from my great aunt, or this wood carving that's been in my family for generations suddenly takes on new meaning. That talismans and devices and things like that may not be held by the person who made them initially and may indeed be centuries old. It gave the idea that they can also store quintessence and paradox in addition to just kind of generating an effect. We get the idea of a periapt or a matrix, which is just a quintessence battery. We get rules on how to recharge them, which was nice. We get the idea of merits and flaws, that a magical item may have a dark fate or may have a guiche on it or something like that, which I thought was kind of interesting. And it introduced a bunch of effects pertaining to how that might work, how you might enchant an object to make sure that it finds you in your next iteration or something. The other thing that was key to me here was the idea that backgrounds are not diegetic. They are not something that necessarily exists in game. It is perfectly reasonable for an item to have 3 dots of fame. That you have an item that among mages would instantly make you recognize as, oh man, you have the sword of blah-de-blah. That's, and then you become known for that. It also does something that is a deviation from previous editions, which is to say it doesn't try and nerf things. There is one of my favorite sidebars in all of Mage, which is the Charm, Talismanic, Fetish, Amulet, Artifact, Periapt that's also your familiar, your ally, and your unique focus. And basically what it says is, if you have a player that wants to have a thing that does everything, if they pay for it, let them. That's why they paid for it. And I really liked that, as dumb as that may sound. We also get information on charms and amulets and relics, which is when an effect is woven into a body part. And otherwise, we get a big expansion of wonders.
Yeah, this was like a drink from the fire hose in terms of wonders. It was so much information. I can see how these new game terms, artifact and invention, are supposed to give us a more fine-tuned understanding of this wonder versus that wonder. But honestly, I think it's just too much game terms. I mean, I don't think I would use these game terms with my own players. I think it's getting to be a bit much. The fetish section, I'm glad that they have a section that got into detail talking about how fetishes are different from standard wonders. But really, the whole section was written from this werewolf dream speaker point of view. It seemed to only be considering middle umbra and not the high umbra. So a little bit of a disappointment there. The idea of a creator is very, very intimately connected with the wonder. I thought that was cool, and it kind of made sense. If the creator is going to put one of his or her own dot of permanent willpower into the item, then it kind of makes sense that connection is there between them. And that's new. That was not seen in the first 2 editions of the game. But at the same time, I would prefer if this were to be optional, because it's such a big change, and I like the idea of someone being able to craft a magic item that is not so intimately connected with them. So it'd be nice to find a way to make that optional, but a very, very cool idea. Basically, it says the creators so closely connect to the wonder that they can give the wonder to someone, and like a year later on the other side of the world, someone is using that wonder, and the creator says, haha, I feel a disturbance in the force. They are using my wonder in a way that I do not approve of. I will now reach through the ether and take it away from them, or turn it off, or something like that. And it's like, wow, that's a very, very close connection between creator and wonder. And I like that they introduced that to the game. I just don't like the fact that it is now the de facto, for every wonder and for everyone. It'd be nice to make that optional. The idea of tying merits, flaws, and backgrounds to wonders it's not new, but I like that they spelled it out in this book, because I always felt it was something like some storytellers were doing, other storytellers were like, no, that's weird, I can't do that. And now it's like spelled out in the book, so it's like, hey, this is available to everyone now. We want you to really consider this. So that was cool to see that there. The idea that sleepers can use talismans if the sleeper is lined up with the paradigm under which the wonder was created. It makes sense to me, and I think that can make for some cool scenes in games, but it is a change to the way the world of Mage is structured. I mean, in the past, the first two editions, sleepers could not use talismans. And although that may put a wet blanket on some possibilities in your games, it also helped to explain how mages can keep their world hidden from sleepers. And if sleepers can now use talismans, it's something to consider in your games. It's like, how does this change things? How far do I want to go with this? So it's just something that I'd like storytellers to keep in mind. It is a change to the world of Mage, and don't let it get out of hand without considering it. And I guess the next section is the familiars. Why don't you introduce that to us, Terry?
Yeah, the familiars, it gives us more information on creating, caring, and feeding familiar. It talks about the lengthy spirit quest and crafting the physical shell, what that interchange will look like, how that negotiation works, what the binding is in varying by it. And then it just says, go over here to calculate its total power. And you're like, oh, okay. That you provide quintessence, and that when it leaves, you wind up losing a point of willpower. And I'm not sure why it was here. It seemed like this could be something that could be trimmed down and shoved into the main book. We get a little bit more information about Mr. Mistopheles, but really, I mean, I've never been a huge... I guess this will bleed into my commentary on Chapter 4 as a whole, but to me, the cost versus benefits of familiars and wonders are really hard to dial in. It is really hard to figure out, does this familiar that gives me this but needs this much quintessence in a world where that might be very hard to find unless we use M20 rules and I just have to burn down an abandoned house every week to feed it. Consult my SRD for more information on turning fire into quintessence. It was always something where I just kind of threw up my shoulders, and I just hope that none of my players are that interested in it. Currently, my only familiar that I have is a character who has picked up a pet rock, and that is the level of familiar that I can deal with.
Yeah, it was interesting to see all these very detailed discussions on every which way you can use a wonder, and then some. And then in the same chapter, it's like, and now for familiars. Yeah, those familiars. Yeah, you're good. Yep. Go look at your core book. We got those rules down. And so that was a bit odd. But at the same time, they had some ideas and suggestions for familiars that I thought was really interesting. For example, they say, here's 3 examples of a cat familiar. There's Mr. Mephistopheles and these other 2 types. And one was a stuffed animal of a cat that if you feed it a quintessence, it can appear as a physical normal earth cat and run around, and everyone will think it's an actual cat. And it traditionally has spent a lot of time around children, and it likes to be with child mages and children who are more likely to awaken. So I liked the expanded amount of ideas for familiars. I think it's very easy for people to fall into the talking animal rut. It's like, oh, well, mine's a raven, mine's a cat, mine's a dog, and they all talk, and there we go, that's familiars. It's like, no, you can do more with this, and I like to see those cool ideas.
And if you want to blow the doors off of that, to skip ahead a little bit, might I recommend that you look at Gods and Monsters, which has like 700 pages on how to turn your PDA into a dragon. And with that, we get to the end. We get the back cover. So what'd you think about the book overall, Adam?
Well, let's see. Overall, I guess my one criticism of this would be in the organization. They put some things in the overflow book, which, for example, the wonders, I thought really should have been in the core book, and they should have picked some of the stuff from the core book and moved it in here, because after a person buys these books, puts them on their shelf, a few months later, they get this, they're running a game, they're talking with people online. It's like, oh, I need to look that up. And naturally, your mind goes to the core book. Mm-hmm. Hey, I'm talking about talismans, I'm talking about familiars, I'm talking about arcane, all these basic mage things. I'm going to look in my core book, and if I can't find it, I'm unhappy. And it's easy to forget that it was in the overflow book. I mean, it's so thin. I mean, even on your shelf, it's hard to even see it when your eyes are going over all your mage books. It's easy to overlook it. So it seems like if something is likely to be pretty key to games, or something that players are really going to be asking you about, it's really, if at all possible, get it into the core book and let the overflow book be stuff that's fun and interesting, but not so crucial. For example, second edition Mage, the core book had an overflow book, and the overflow book had fun, interesting stuff in it, but it wasn't, so key and crucial. So if you're looking up basic things for second edition, you go to the core book and you're good. You're going to be all right.
It's kind of interesting to me because World of Darkness never quite picked up on the D&D style storyteller book, player book. And sometimes I wish it had done that, but it raises the barrier of entry in that you can no longer get everything you need in a single book. And this book kind of drove that home, where it says Storyteller's Companion. Okay, but these are also things that a player might want to consider, like, oh, I want to be a Batin mage, or I want to be a craft mage, or something like that. Or as a player, I want to build a wonder or something like that. That to me is a player-facing rule. We never quite do that in Mage. It did leave me wanting more in a bunch of places, but it does tell me what the world looks like in Revised. We do get some answers to why the world is this way, but again, that is information that we've already gotten before Revised even hit. We get a little bit more detail in the Avatar Storm, but we are now 2 books into Revised, and we still don't know kind of what the new Umbra looks like. We still don't know what the ruins of Dewizatep or Horizon look like. And to me, I feel it is yanking players around a little bit to not yet have answers to those questions from these 2 books. That's just me. Like, if I were to finish those 2, those would be the first things where I'd be like, man, they still didn't answer this.
One thing that I noticed when reading through this book, especially chapter 4 with the information on wonders, it's nice to have a lot of options, but at this point the rules are getting so detailed and handling so many situations that I start to think of so many discussions going online when role-playing fans come together. One of the things they mention is something called rules creep. And rules creep is a an informal way of referring to the fact that if you look through multiple editions of most games, you'll see that the rules get more complex, more detailed as time goes on. Of course, the easiest example to talk to general audiences, of course, Dungeons and Dragons. When the original Dungeons and Dragons, it was very loose and free and open. And as time went on, you finally got up to 3rd edition and edition 3.5, where I swear, as a gaming fan, I would get some of those books at my friends' houses and read through them. And I felt like I was reading an accountant's spreadsheet more than a role-playing game book, because the rules were just so very detailed. And of course, Mage didn't get to that point, but I'm starting to get that feeling with these revised books. It's like I go through a section on rules, and it's like we're going to discuss every angle of this and every permutation. And it's like I know it's me personally, but at the end of the chapter, I'm feeling exhausted. It's like, wow, that was a whole lot to take in on wonders. There was so many different ways to do it. How much of this am I going to really want to interact with? I mean, how much of my players going to take an interest in? I guess it's nice to have all these options, but boy, I mean, reading through it can be kind of rough, and remembering it all afterwards, it's like, wow, there's so much to keep in my head.
Yeah, this was seemingly the height of the book full of capitalized in-world game terms, where, like, I'm glad that we have the word charm, I guess, but you could have also said, like, single-use item, or something like that, or sacred item, or quintessence battery, or something else that wasn't just another somewhat esoteric noun that kind of did the same thing.
Yeah, and for everything we need the technocrat version of it. I mean, for every single one. And so it's like, after a while, it's like an alphabet soup in your head with all these game terms. Like, wow, gosh.
Yeah. Yeah, I remember initially when it was like, oh, they don't have Dream, they have Hypercram. They don't have an Avatar, they have an Eidolon. That's kind of cool. But then as we get, oh, we also have a different term for every sphere. That's a bit much. I don't quite need life essence manipulation sciences or something. I'm just going to call it life.
And when you're running game sessions and talking with your players, like, look, I pull out my device. Wait a minute, you're not a technocrat. No, it's lowercase t. Oh, sorry.
Is that appropriate in a mixed group? Yeah, these things get real ambiguous real fast. What do we read next?
Well, next up, we're going to look at Bitter Road. And boy, there's a cheery title for you.
Yeah, exactly. And it has another Christopher Shy illustration of a genderless person staring into the middle distance on the cover. So what's there not to love?
Yeah, but Bitter Road will be quite interesting for me because I only was able to skim through it, and that was quite a while back. And Bitter Road is the book that, as a developer, I would put next in line in dealing with Revised Edition. It really solidifies the setting. It's like, this is what life is like for mages on Earth now after the Avatar Storm. These are the problems they deal with. This is the stuff they tell each other and talk about. And so it's the right book to put next in line for Revised Edition.
Yep, and that is as much of what Jesse Heinig said, that it was one of the books in Revised that he was most proud of in terms of establishing the setting and such, and I look forward to reading it with you.
Definitely. That is going to be in our next episode of Tomes of Magic. But for now, do you have a quote for the book?
I do. It talks about, there's a section where it talks about things that you would do to make a wonder less prone to breakage. And it talks about the Matter 3 or Matter 5 effect, the Aura Adamantium. And the Matter 5 variant alloys the object with adamantium, the strongest substance known to legend or comic book, and prevents destruction by all but similarly extremely magical effects. And I really like the phrase, the strongest substance known to legend or comic book.
Yeah.
Take us out, Adam.
Fun. Yeah, well, it was fun flipping through this book because I saw 2 J. Cobb illustrations. And, of course, J. Cobb had a lot of illustrations in the early days of first edition, and then he kind of dropped out for a while. And so I'm looking at those like, oh, hey, that's fun. But, okay, if you have something to say, please contact us at magethepodcast@gmail.com with your questions, comments, or feedback. We're always ready to read those. Subscribe to Mage the Podcast on iTunes, Google Play, TuneIn, or other aggregator sites. If you like the show, others might like it too. And if you leave a review of Mage the Podcast, it helps us become more visible in their searches. So if you're enjoying our content, please consider that. You can also follow us on Twitter at Mage the Podcast. We're also on the web at magethepodcast.com. You can listen to past episodes there and see the complete show notes, which is something I like to refer back to myself. So I wouldn't miss them for anything. This episode is thanks to executive producers like Ira Grace, Richard Batt Brewster, John Magnuson, Jenna F., Andrew Edelstein, Chris Zach, Christopher Phillips, Bryce Perry, Brendan Morrill, Andrew Katz, Michael Parker, Anders, and Justin. If you would like to become an executive producer for Mage the Podcast, it would help us keep producing episodes like this one and our special interviews. You would also become a part of our own council to discuss upcoming projects. The link is in the show notes to get you started, and we encourage you to consider. Well, thanks everyone for listening, and until next time, truth until paradox, baby.
Go change the world. Bye.